I almost didn't stop the car that night. That's the part that still keeps me awake sometimes. If the light hadn't turned red at that exact second, if I hadn't glanced out the window out of pure boredom, I would have driven straight past the most important moment of my life without ever knowing it happened. A 7-year-old girl was standing alone outside a hospital entrance at 11 o'clock at night, soaked from the rain, shaking with no coat, no umbrella, and no adult anywhere near her. And in her small closed fist, she was holding a folded piece of paper, like it was the only thing keeping her standing upright. I didn't know it yet, but that piece of paper was about to expose a secret that 3 powerful families had spent years burying. Stay with me, because what was written on that note changed everything for her and for me. My name is Weston Cole. If you've read anything about me in the business press, you probably know the headline version. Self-made, college dropout turned logistics and technology entrepreneur. Net worth that sounds unreal when people say it out loud. What most articles don't mention is that I grew up with almost nothing in a 2-bedroom apartment in Cleveland, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a diner, and a father who left before I could form real memories of him. I built my company from a garage with 2 employees and a used delivery van. By the time I was 36, that company had grown into something with warehouses on 4 continents. Money changes a lot of things about a person's life. It did not change the fact that I remembered clearly what it felt like to be a child nobody was watching out for. I was in the city that week for a hospital foundation dinner, the kind of event where wealthy people write checks and take photos next to a check that's the size of a door. I'd left early. The small talk had worn thin, and I told my driver to take the long way back to the hotel, so I could think. That's when we passed the hospital's side entrance, the quiet one away from the main doors in the ambulance bay. And that's when I saw her. She was standing under a narrow awning that barely kept the rain off her shoulders, wearing a thin yellow dress that was clearly meant for warmer weather, her dark hair plastered flat against her face. She wasn't screaming or wailing the way children sometimes do. She was crying the quiet way, the kind of crying that comes from someone who has already learned that loud crying doesn't bring anyone running. I told my driver to stop the car before I had even fully decided to do it. I got out into the rain without an umbrella, which is not something a man in a $3,000 suit typically does, and I crouched down in front of her, keeping my distance so I wouldn't scare her. I asked her name. It took her a long moment to answer. She said it was Nora. I asked where her mom or dad was. She looked toward the hospital doors and said her mommy was inside, and that a lady had told her to wait outside because there wasn't room for her in the room anymore. I asked if anyone was coming to get her. She shook her head slowly, like she already knew the answer and hated saying it out loud. That's when I noticed she was gripping something in her right hand, so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. I asked what she was holding. She hesitated, glanced up at me with an expression I will never fully be able to describe, something between fear and desperate hope, and then she held out to me a folded, rain-damp piece of notebook paper. She said her mommy told her to give it to someone who looked like they could actually help, and to nobody else. Not a stranger who just seemed nice. Someone who could actually do something. I remember thinking, even in that moment, what kind of situation makes a dying woman train her 7-year-old to evaluate strangers by their ability to solve problems instead of their kindness? I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it's the detail that told me, before I ever unfolded that paper, that whatever was happening inside that hospital was not a simple story about a sick mother and a scared child. It was something with edges, something with people in it who had already failed her once. I asked her one more question before I ever looked at the paper. I asked if she was hungry. It seems like a strange thing to focus on, given everything else happening, but children in crisis don't usually respond well to a stranger's direct questions about danger or fear. They respond to small kindness first. She nodded just barely and admitted she hadn't eaten since breakfast. That single detail told me the 2 hours the nurse would later confirm wasn't the whole story. This little girl had likely been forgotten, overlooked, or deliberately ignored for the better part of an entire day, and nobody inside that building had noticed enough to feed her. I sent my driver back to the car for the bag of snacks I kept for long flights. Absurd as that sounds, the kind of granola bars and juice boxes and assistant packs for a man who never actually eats them. Nora ate like she hadn't trusted that food would still be there if she paused between bites. I watched her, and something settled into my chest that I can only describe as resolve. Whatever this note said, whatever situation I was about to step into, I already knew I wasn't walking away from it once I understood it. I carried Nora inside, out of the rain, and I sat her down in the family waiting area near the intensive care unit, wrapped in my own suit jacket, because it was the only dry thing either of us had. A nurse recognized me from a fundraiser earlier that night and rushed over, more concerned about a billionaire sitting on hospital carpet than about the shivering child beside him, which told me something about how people had been treating this whole situation. I asked her plainly who was responsible for this little girl and why she had been standing outside alone. The nurse's face changed. She said the social worker on call had stepped away for another emergency and that the mother, a patient named Elena Whitmore, had been asking for someone to watch her daughter for almost 2 hours. 2 hours. A 7-year-old had been alone outside a hospital, in the rain, for 2 hours, while her mother lay somewhere upstairs unable to help her. I felt something tighten in my chest that had nothing to do with money or business instincts. It was a particular kind of anger that comes from recognition. Before I did anything else, I unfolded the note. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written by someone in pain, someone rushing against time they knew they didn't have much of. It read, "If you are reading this, I can get a phone in time, and I need to trust a stranger with the only thing I have left. My name is Elena Whitmore. My daughter is Nora. She has no one else. Her father is gone. My sister will not answer. Please don't let them put her in the system before you read what's in the envelope taped under the third drawer of my kitchen desk at 214 Larkspur Lane. There are papers there that prove what my family did to me. Please, whoever you are, don't let them win because I ran out of time." I read it twice before I fully understood what I was holding. This wasn't a woman asking a stranger for babysitting help. This was a woman who believed, correctly or not, that she was dying, and that her death was somehow connected to something her own family had done, and she had entrusted the proof of it to whichever stranger her daughter judged capable enough to act on it. I asked the nurse to take me to Elena Whitmore's room immediately. What I found upstairs made the note feel even heavier. Elena was in the ICU, connected to more machines than I could count, unconscious, her chart showing acute liver failure that had progressed with unusual speed for a woman who, according to her records, had been perfectly healthy 8 months earlier. 8 months. I asked the attending physician what could cause that kind of decline in someone so young, someone in her early 30s with no prior history of illness. He said the pattern was unusual enough that they'd already flagged it for toxicology review, but the results hadn't come back yet. Unusual enough to flag for toxicology. Those words sat in my stomach like a stone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in that waiting room with Nora curled against my side, finally calm enough to doze off from exhaustion, while I turned the note over and over in my mind. A dying woman, a missing father, a sister who wouldn't answer, hidden papers under a desk drawer, and a mysterious, rapid illness that doctors themselves found suspicious. I built companies by recognizing patterns other people missed. Every instinct I had was screaming that this was not a tragic accident. This was something someone had done, and someone had covered up carefully enough that even a dying mother didn't trust the police to find it in time. Around 3 a.m, a hospital social worker finally arrived to process what she assumed was a routine abandonment case, and I got my first real taste of how quickly a child in Nora's position could disappear into a system that, however well-intentioned, was not designed for a situation this specific. The social worker, a tired woman named Denise who I could tell had seen far too many of these nights to count, explained gently that if no verified family member could be reached by morning, Nora would need to be placed in an emergency foster arrangement while the hospital sorted out Elena's condition and any next of kin. I asked her what verified family member meant in practical terms. She said it meant someone with legal standing, a parent, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle willing to step forward with identification and proof of relation. I thought about the note in my pocket, about a sister who wouldn't answer, and I understood in that moment that whoever this sister was, she had already... I found the taped envelope exactly where the note said it would be, tucked beneath the underside of a desk drawer, hidden well enough that it wasn't something you'd stumble on by accident. Inside were photocopies of financial records, a handwritten letter from Elena's father dated only weeks before his death, and something else that made my blood run cold. A lab report, unofficial, clearly obtained through a private toxicology service, showing trace levels of the substance in a blood sample labeled with Elena's name from 3 months earlier. Someone had already suspected something was wrong long before that night in the hospital waiting room. Elena had been quietly testing her own blood. I sat with Elena's father's letter for a long time that first night at Larkspur Lane, reading his words over and over. He wrote about regret, about wishing he'd trusted his instincts about Margot years earlier, about how proud he was of Elena for building a life on her own terms instead of waiting around for the family business to hand her a comfortable future. There was a line near the bottom that I still think about. He wrote that the people who love you the loudest in front of others are not always the ones who love you the most when no one else is watching. I didn't know this man. He died months before I ever became part of his daughter's life. But reading that line in his own shaking handwriting, I understood exactly what kind of father he had tried to be, and exactly how badly his trust in the wrong daughter had cost the one who actually deserved it. This was no longer a story about inheritance disputes. This was a story about a woman who believed she was being poisoned, slowly, by someone close enough to have access to her food or her medication, and who had run out of time to prove it before collapsing. The tins, Ruth remembered, turned out to matter after all. Laboratory analysis of the residue inside 2 of the discarded containers found trace amounts of the same heavy compound that would later show up in Elena's blood work, present in concentrations too high to be accidental contamination. Someone had been lacing something as ordinary and comforting as a cup of tea, something a grieving sister might bring over out of what looked to any outsider like love, and turning it into a weapon slow enough that no doctor would think to look for it until it was almost too late. I remember reading that lab report in my office at 2 a.m, alone, and having to sit with the fact that Margot Frost had likely sat across a kitchen table from her own sister, poured that tea herself, and smiled while she did it. I brought everything to my attorney and, through her, to a forensic toxicologist I trusted from prior work with the hospital foundation. Within 2 days, the hospital's own testing confirmed what Elena had feared. Her system showed elevated levels of a heavy compound consistent with long-term low-dose exposure, the kind that mimics natural organ failure if nobody is specifically looking for it. It was slow, it was deliberate, and it had been happening for months. I want to pause here and tell you honestly what that discovery did to me. I have negotiated deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars without my pulse changing. I have sat across from people trying to destroy my company and felt nothing but strategic calculation. But sitting in that sterile hospital conference room, hearing a doctor confirm that a mother of a 7-year-old girl had likely been poisoned over months by someone in her own life, while her daughter sat in a waiting room down the hall, not understanding any of it, I felt something close to rage for the first time in years. And I made a decision right then that I would use every resource I had to find out exactly who did this and why. The obvious place to look was Margot and Julian Frost. I hired an independent investigative team, separate from my company, separate from anything that could be traced back to influence or intimidation, because I needed this handled cleanly enough to survive a courtroom, not just satisfy my own suspicions. What they found over the following 2 weeks unraveled faster than I expected. Margot Frost had not simply inherited a company. She had, according to financial records the investigators uncovered, been quietly siphoning funds from the family business for nearly 3 years before her father's death, funneling money into shell accounts connected to her husband Julian's separate real estate ventures that were bleeding money and would have collapsed without an outside cash infusion. Elena's father had apparently begun to suspect something in his final months. The handwritten letter in the envelope, the one dated weeks before his death, wasn't just a promise about inheritance. It was him telling Elena he intended to have the company's books independently audited, and that if anything happened to him before that audit, she should trust nothing Margot told her. He died 3 weeks after writing that letter, officially, from complications related to his existing heart condition. Nobody had questioned it at the time. Nobody had reason to. But once Elena started asking questions after it was surfaced, once she hired her own lawyer to challenge the estate distribution, her health had begun its slow, mysterious decline almost immediately after. Ruth told me something else that night, something she said had bothered her for months, but that she'd never known what to do with. She said Margot had started visiting Elena's house more often after their father's funeral, always arriving with homemade meals, always insisting on bringing over healing teas. She said it helped their father through his own illness. Ruth remembered thinking at the time how thoughtful it seemed, a grieving sister trying to take care of her sibling. She had no reason then to think of it as anything else. It was only after seeing the ambulance outside Elena's house weeks later that the timeline had started to nag at her, quietly. In a way, she said she felt guilty for not acting on sooner. I asked Ruth if she still had any of those containers, the tea tins or the leftover food packaging. She said she believed a few empty tins were still in Elena's recycling bin out back, since trash pickup in the neighborhood only ran every other week. It was a long shot, the kind of detail that sounds meaningful in the moment and turns out to be nothing more than herbal chamomile. But I had my investigators collect them anyway, because in situations like this, you don't get to decide in advance which small thing turns out to matter. I remember staring at the investigator's report and thinking about how close this had come to working perfectly. If Elena had died that week in the hospital, if I hadn't happened to be at that dinner, if that light hadn't turned red at that exact second, Nora would have gone into foster care. The note would have been thrown away by an overwhelmed intake worker, and Margot Frost would have inherited not just a company, but the silence of everyone who could have exposed her. But Elena had done one thing right. She had trusted her daughter to find someone capable, and her daughter had trusted me. While the investigation continued, I filed emergency temporary guardianship for Nora, not because I had any grand plan of adopting her, at least not one I had let myself think about yet, but because the alternative was placing a traumatized 7-year-old into an emergency foster placement while her mother fought for her life in a hospital bed and her aunt possibly plotted her mother's death. The family court judge, after reviewing the note, the hospital abandonment timeline, and statements from Ruth the neighbor, granted the temporary order within 4 days. Nora moved into my home. It was, without question, the strangest transition of my entire life. Learning to braid hair, I had no idea how to braid. Learning what foods a 7-year-old would actually eat. Learning to sit outside a closed bedroom door at 2 a.m, because she was having nightmares about hospital hallways. Margot found out about the guardianship faster than I expected, because of course she did. Money like mine doesn't move quietly, and once a Cole family attorney appears on a custody filing, people notice. She called me directly, which surprised me. Her voice was warm, rehearsed, the voice of someone who had spent years learning exactly how to sound sincere. She thanked me for stepping in during such a difficult time for the family. And then, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that she'd actually been planning to take Nora and herself once things settled down, that it had simply been a chaotic week, and she hadn't had the chance yet. I asked her, calmly, why a woman planning to take in her own niece hadn't visited the hospital once in the 2 weeks Elena had been unconscious. There was a pause on the line long enough to tell me everything I needed to know. She recovered quickly, said something about being overwhelmed with the company and the estate matters, and asked, almost too casually, whether I had happened to find anything of Elena's when I had been at the house. Papers, files, anything like that. That question told me she already suspected the note existed. It told me she was afraid of exactly what I now had in my possession. I told her nothing. I ended the call, and I called my attorney immediately to accelerate every filing we could accelerate, because a woman who poisons her own sister over a company is not a woman who will simply accept losing custody of a 7-year-old witness to how convenient that sister's death would have been. 2 nights later, my head of security called me home to tell me a car had been parked outside my property for nearly 40 minutes. Engine off. No plates visible from the street angle his team could see. I won't pretend that call didn't rattle me. I had Nora asleep 2 floors above me, a little girl who had already been failed by every adult who was supposed to protect her, and now possibly being watched by people connected to the exact person trying to make her mother's death look natural. I doubled the security detail that night without hesitation, and for the first time since this whole situation began, I let myself fully consider just how far Margot and Julian might be willing to go to keep their scheme from unraveling. The car was gone by morning, and we were never able to conclusively tie it to the Frosts. But it changed how carefully I moved from that point forward. I stopped discussing details of the investigation over phone calls. I started meeting my attorney and the investigators only in person, in rooms we swept beforehand. It felt paranoid, almost theatrical, until I reminded myself that someone had already tried to quietly end one life to protect a company's balance sheet, and there was no reason to assume they'd suddenly develop a conscience just because their first attempt had failed. 3 days later, Julian Frost showed up at my office unannounced, without his wife, which told me they had, at minimum, different levels of panic about the situation. He was smoother than I expected, dressed the part, spoke the language of a man used to getting what he wanted through charm rather than force. He said he wanted to discuss what he called a private resolution regarding Nora's guardianship and the ongoing questions about the company's finances. He offered, without ever quite saying it outright, that if I quietly stepped back from custody proceedings and let the family handle things internally, there would be what he called a significant expression of gratitude for my trouble. He was offering to bribe me to hand a traumatized child over to the woman who had likely poisoned her mother. I want to tell you I stayed perfectly calm through that meeting, because that's the kind of story that sounds impressive afterward. The truth is, I nearly threw him out of my building myself before my head of security did it more professionally. What I did do, and I'm grateful for it now, was let him keep talking, because in trying to convince me, Julian said something he clearly hadn't meant to reveal. He referenced insurance policy timing being unfortunate, given how things had turned out with Lena still alive. It was a small phrase, said quickly, but it was enough. It meant there was a life insurance policy on Elena, one they had expected to collect on. One whose payout structure they were apparently. The policy had been backdated in the system to appear as though it had existed for nearly 2 years. But the actual filing timestamp in the insurer's internal server logs showed it had been submitted only 8 months earlier, the same week Elena's toxicology markers first began climbing, according to her own private testing. Someone had built the financial motive at almost the exact moment they started building the method. What we found was a final piece. 8 months earlier, around the exact time Elena's mysterious decline began, a life insurance policy worth $4 million had been taken out on her, with Margot Frost listed as the primary beneficiary, filed through paperwork that Elena herself had apparently never signed, but that bore a signature close enough to hers to pass a cursory glance. Combined with the embezzlement records, the toxicology results, and Julian's own accidental admission, the picture was no longer circumstantial. It was a complete, documented motive, method, and cover-up. I turned everything over to the district attorney's office myself, along with my attorney and the independent investigators, rather than leaking anything publicly, because I needed this handled by people with the authority to actually prosecute it, not by headlines that could be spun or discredited. Margot and Julian Frost were both arrested within the same week. Margot on charges connected to attempted poisoning and insurance fraud, Julian on charges of forgery and conspiracy. The company's books, once independently audited as Elena's father had wanted before he died, revealed even more discrepancies than the initial investigation had found, enough that the business itself was placed under receivership while the fraud case proceeded. There was a moment, on day 6, when I thought I might lose her before any of this could be resolved. Her fever spiked overnight. Her organ function markers dropped sharply, and the attending physician pulled me aside in the hallway to gently suggest I consider whether Nora should be prepared for the possibility that her mother might not recover. I remember standing in that hallway, a man who had negotiated some of the largest acquisitions in his industry, completely unable to find a single useful thing to say. I went back to the waiting room where Nora was drawing quietly at a little plastic table, and she looked up at me and asked, without any hesitation, whether her mommy was going to wake up. I told her the truth, that the doctors were working very hard, and that I didn't know for certain, but that I wasn't going anywhere until we found out together. She nodded, the way children do when they've decided to trust an answer, even if it isn't the one they wanted, and went back to her drawing. It was a picture of a hospital with a bright yellow sun above it, and when I asked her about it later, she said she was drawing the day her mommy would come home, because she wanted it ready when it happened. Elena's fever broke 2 days later, and her numbers began slowly to stabilize. I've never been a religious man, and I won't pretend that changed that week. But I understood, watching her vitals climb back towards something survivable, exactly how much of this had come down to timing that no one, least of all me, could take credit for. Elena woke up 9 days after I found Nora outside that hospital entrance. I wasn't in the room when it happened. Nora was, because I made sure she was allowed to be there the moment doctors said visitors could return, and I will never forget the sound of a 7-year-old running down a hospital hallway screaming for her mother, or the sight of Elena, weak, confused, tube still in her arms, wrapping her daughter into the tightest embrace I have ever witnessed two human beings share. I stood in the doorway and didn't go in right away. Some moments aren't meant to have an audience, even one who helped make the moment possible. When Elena was finally strong enough to speak with me directly, about 2 weeks later, she asked me the question I imagined she'd been holding on to since the moment she first opened her eyes. She asked how I knew to look for the papers, how I had understood what the note even meant. I told her the truth. I told her that her daughter had handed me the note like it was the most important thing she'd ever been trusted with, because that's exactly what it was, and that I simply refused to be the kind of person who reads something like that and looks away. Elena cried for a long time after that. Not from grief this time. From something closer to disbelief that, after everything her own family had done to her, a complete stranger had chosen to become the person who didn't look away. The criminal case against Margot and Julian Frost took the better part of a year to fully resolve, and I attended nearly every hearing I was permitted to sit in on, not because my attorney needed me there, but because I had made Nora a promise, quietly one night when she asked if the people who hurt her mommy would ever have to say sorry in front of a judge. I told her I didn't know if they'd ever say sorry, but I promised her they would have a stand in front of one. I intended to keep that promise, even if it just meant being a face in the gallery. The preliminary hearing was the first time I saw Margot since Julian's visit to my office. She looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of the rehearsed warmth she'd used on the phone, her attorney doing most of the talking while she stared at a spot on the table in front of her. Elena did not attend that hearing. Her doctors had advised against the stress so soon after her discharge, and I understood, watching Margot from across the room, exactly why that caution mattered. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing the person who nearly killed you is also the person who once braided your hair as a child, and I don't think anyone should be asked to carry that weight before they're ready. Margot eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a lengthy prison sentence, avoiding a trial that her own attorneys apparently told her she had no realistic chance of winning once the toxicology results, the T10 residue, the backdated insurance filing, and Julian's own recorded admission were all laid out together. I sat in the gallery the day she entered that plea, and when the judge read the sentence aloud, 22 years with the possibility of parole after 14, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph, just a quiet, heavy relief that Nora would grow up in a world where the person who did this to her mother would not be free to try again. Julian received a separate sentence for the forgery and fraud charges, 12 years, and testified against Margot as part of his own plea arrangement, which was, in its own bitter way, a fitting final betrayal between two people who built their entire scheme on betraying someone else. The company Elena's father had built was eventually restructured under new leadership with no ties to either of them, and Elena, once she recovered, was awarded her rightful share of its value as part of the civil settlement that followed the criminal case, enough to rebuild a stable life for herself and Nora without ever needing anyone's charity, including mine. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters more than the dramatic parts of this story. I did not become a billionaire savior swooping in to fix a broken family with money, and I don't want to tell it that way. What actually happened is quieter than that. Elena and Nora stayed connected to my life not because I rescued them, but because something real had formed between us during those terrifying weeks, something none of us had expected or planned for. Nora, once her mother was stable and strong again, still asked to visit some weekends, still called me on her birthday, still sent me drawings of the two of us standing outside the hospital in the rain. Except in her drawings, the rain was always drawn as tiny gold stars instead of blue lines, which she told me once was because that was the night things actually got better instead of worse. Elena and I built something slower, something that took real time to become what it eventually became. Trust, after what she'd survived, was not something she gave easily, and I never expected her to. There were entire months where she pulled away without explanation, where she'd cancel plans at the last minute or go quiet for days, and I learned, slowly, not to take it personally. A woman who had been poisoned by her own sister for over a year had every reason in the world to be careful about who she let close, No matter how many boxes I checked or how many hospital hallways we had already survived together, I stopped trying to rush anything. I simply stayed consistent, the way I had promised Nora I would that first night, and let Elena set whatever pace she needed. We started as two people bound together by an impossible night, then as friends who checked in on each other through a recovery that was both physical and emotional, and eventually, quietly, as something more than that. I'm not going to pretend our story became some fairy tale ending wrapped in a bow. Healing doesn't work that fast, and I wouldn't trust a story that claimed it did. There were setbacks. There were nights Elena woke up from nightmares about hospital rooms just like Nora did. Nights we sat on opposite ends of the couch not saying much of anything, because there wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said in a courtroom or a deposition. What I will tell you is that 2 years after that night outside the hospital, Elena and Nora moved into a home not far from my own. Close enough that Nora could still run over on weekends. Far enough that Elena kept the independence she had fought so hard to reclaim. I think about that red light constantly. I think about how a single unremarkable second, a stopped car at an intersection I didn't need to be at, became the hinge that an entire family's future turned on. I think about how close an entire criminal scheme came to succeeding simply because everyone involved assumed a dying woman's warnings, and a frightened child's note would never reach anyone capable of taking them seriously. Here's what I've come to believe, and it's the reason I'm telling you this story at all. Wealth, power, connections, none of it means anything if you use it only to protect yourself. I've sat in boardrooms with people who have more money than they could spend across 10 lifetimes, and I've watched plenty of them walk past far smaller emergencies than a crying child outside a hospital, simply because stopping wasn't convenient, or because getting involved carried some risk to their carefully managed reputation. The measure of what you've built isn't how comfortable it makes your own life. It's whether you're still the kind of person who stops the car, who reads a note, who refuses to hand a frightened child back to whoever seems the most confident, the most convincing, the most eager to make the problem quietly disappear. Nora is 9 years old now. She still keeps that original folded note, laminated, in a small box in her room, next to a drawing of gold stars falling like rain. She's told me more than once that she wants to be a lawyer when she grows up, someone who helps other kids the way she felt helped that night, and I have no doubt at all that she will become exactly that, because I have never met anyone so young with such a clear sense of what fairness is supposed to look like. Elena still can't talk about that night without her voice catching, but she talks about it anyway, every year, on the anniversary of the day she woke up, because she says the world needs to know that sometimes the people who save you aren't the ones you expect, and sometimes the smallest act, trusting a child to choose wisely, ends up being the bravest decision anyone in the whole story ever made. I think, too, about Ruth, the neighbor who almost didn't mention the tea tins because she wasn't sure it mattered. And I think about how many cases like this one probably go unsolved simply because the person holding the one small detail that would break it open assumes their observation is too insignificant to bring forward. I've since funded a small legal advocacy fund through my foundation, quietly, without my name attached to the press releases, specifically to help families in situations like Elena's, financially disadvantaged parties facing wealthier relatives in contested estate and guardianship cases, who otherwise wouldn't have the resources to hire the kind of investigators that cracked this case open. It felt like the least useful thing money could do, compared to everything else it's capable of, and also somehow the most important. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's simple. You never know which ordinary moment in your life is actually the most important one you'll ever face. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with music swelling in the background or some obvious sign telling you this is the moment that matters. It looks exactly like every other red light you've ever sat through, every other rainy night you've ever driven home tired and distracted, every other small decision to notice something instead of scrolling past it. Pay attention. Stop the car. Read the note. You might be the only person standing between someone and the ending they were never supposed to have, and you might never get a second chance to find that out.